Now checking in with our regular Tuesday guest here on a Wednesday. Had to juggle some things around. Saying good morning now to Dr. Gary Ostrower.
A pleasure to be here, as usual.
Dr. Gary Ostrower, the longtime history professor at Alfred University. Okay, Dr. Ostrower, I wanted to get your thoughts here. The statements against President Trump by Colin Powell and General Mattis. And the way I want to ask the question is this. We know the conservatives will roll their eyes and say, you know, these are just never Trumpers. We know that the liberals will say, see, this proves the point. My question is, the middle of the road voters who still vote, the people who aren't necessarily aligned to one party or other, could go either direction. How do you think it'll affect them?
I think there's going to be a shift. And to say that I think there's going to be a shift doesn't necessarily mean that there will be. But the reason I think there's going to be a shift in their sentiment, becoming more critical of the president, is because someone like, for instance, General Mattis was anything but a never Trumper. Quite the contrary. He was Trump's choice for Secretary of Defense. He served in that capacity for 2 years, and he served very, very loyally. Now, what kind of disagreements he may have had with the president internally, for the most part, we really don't know very much about that. Although we do know that when President Trump made the decision, without consulting Mattis, to pull the American troops out of Syria, ordered Mattis to do this, essentially stabbing our Kurdish allies in the back. That was, I think, the last straw for Mattis, and so he resigned. But he certainly was not, and I don't think that anyone would view him as a, quote, never Trumper. Powell did not vote for Trump in 2016. I don't know who he voted for. I don't know whether he voted for Hillary Clinton or he simply voted for a third-party candidate or he didn't vote at all. But I can tell you that General Powell has been a Republican, a member of the Republican Party. He served Republican administrations. Needless to say, when President Bush 1 was in office, Powell was the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He eventually went into the National Security Council. He was a highly, highly respected individual among both Republicans and Democrats. So will that have an effect on independent voters? The answer is, I suspect that it will. But I suspect that it will for another reason, and that is because Powell and Mattis are not alone. They have been joined by a lot of other military leaders. For instance, Admiral Mullen, who is a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a four-star general. Admiral Mullen also came out with a very, very strong statement in opposition to the president. Admiral Mullen said something to the effect that we are at an inflection point. And I'm reading from a letter that he wrote. We are at an inflection point, and the events of the past few weeks make it impossible to remain silent. Whatever Trump's goal in conducting his visit to that church in Washington where he held the Bible, he laid bare his disdain for the rights of peaceful protest in this country. He gave succor to the leaders of other countries who take comfort in our domestic strife, and he risked further politicizing the men and the women of our armed forces. And he's not the only one to say that. General Milley, who is currently the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made it a point after that church visit, and he was at that church visit. He made a point to try to distance the American military from politics. And I think that you're probably aware, I hope that most people are aware, that 89 former military officials or officials of the Defense Department, 89 of them have sent a letter, made a very, very strong statement in opposition to the policy of the President of the United States. And I think that we're going to have to understand that this is not a never Trump movement. These are people who, for the most part, have been unpolitical, have been non-political. Many of them have served in the two Bush administrations, George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. Some of them in the Clinton administration, some of them in the Obama administration. But they are Defense Department officials, and they see themselves as non-political. And yet they have essentially said that, the time for being non-political is over, that the situation has deteriorated to such an extent that they really must say something. General Mattis said, we have a president, we have an administration that is not mature. We have an administration that is undermining American foreign policy. We have an administration that is weakening the United States rather than strengthening the United States. And so for all of these people, I think, we better understand that, this week is not where we were a year ago. We are alarmed, said those 89 people. We are alarmed at how the president is betraying his oath by threatening to order members of the U.S. military to violate the rights of their fellow Americans.
I'll ask the same question again, only the protests over the week. The middle-of-the-road voters. Now, we know that the left is outraged and disgusted with the police brutality case there out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, the death of George Floyd. The conservatives see this. The conservatives, from what I can tell, don't like what happened to George Floyd, but they see the protest as left-wing opportunistic, just another reason to revolt unnecessarily. So I'm going to ask the question again, that all-important middle-of-the-road voter, how will they see the protests of the last week?
I think we know how they see it. Generally speaking, to the extent that we have political polling data on this already, they are generally sympathetic with the protesters. Not entirely, it's not 100% or 90%, it's something in the neighborhood of 60%, but there's a general sense that black people have not been treated fairly by the police. Now, there are a lot, you know this and I know this, there are a lot of good cops, but there are also some cops who aren't so good. And there are police unions who protect those cops. And consequently, it's not just a matter of the killing of George Floyd. It's the killing of Eric Garner. It's the killing of that fellow Gray in Baltimore. There are many, many other black people who have been killed. What's different now is not that, what happened to George Floyd is fundamentally different than happened to anybody else, but it's that we now have iPhones, we have smartphones, we have people doing videos of all of this. It's become public in a way that it had never become public before. And in that sense, I think, the middle of the road is shifting. There's an interesting, I'm thinking about the question you're asking in this sense. In 1968, there were an awful lot of demonstrations. Some of them were racial, some of them were anti-war. There were 120 cities that experienced violent demonstrations after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And then, of course, at the Democratic National Convention in 1968, that's 52 years ago, shortly after Robert Kennedy was assassinated, there was a lot of rioting, much of it, I might add, instigated not by the protesters, but rather by the police. But in either case, the Republican nominee for president in that year, Richard Nixon, used those demonstrations, used those protests, used those violence as a kind of political tool. He ran on the slogan of law and order. And while he won only narrowly, he did win the presidency. And I think that President Trump has kind of taken that. He's assumed that he could use the protests that have occurred right now. He's exaggerated the amount of violence. He has certainly exaggerated the role of the so-called Antifa group. There's really no evidence that Antifa has instigated any of the violence at all. But that's not line that's coming out of President Trump, or for that matter, from Fox News. But nevertheless, I think that the president gambled that the public would support him on this, that in much the same way that the public rallied around the law and order slogan in 1968, they'd rally around it in 2020. And the president may have gambled wrong. He may have misread the role of the public at this point, the reaction of the public, in light of the degree to which we have all of these videos. They have changed public opinion.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, the longtime Alfred University history professor. Former President Jimmy Carter weighed in recently, saying we need a government as good as its people, and the people are better than this, said Jimmy Carter's statement. I'll say what the conservatives say to that, but I want to get your reaction first.
Well, I think what Carter means, if I understand what he's saying, and I didn't read his statement initially, is that you can't use the government against the people. When the president says, as he said, this past week, and not only the president, but certainly the Attorney General, William Barr, that our cities have become a, quote, battle space. What he's essentially saying is that peaceful protesters are the enemy. Not violent protesters, peaceful protesters are the enemy. When the president cleared Lafayette Square in Washington for that photo op in front of the church, the people there were not violent. The people there were in no way protesting violently. That was the use of the army, the use of our troops against, then use of our police against peaceful protesters. And that is what I think has led to the very, very sharp reaction of people like General Mattis and Admiral Mullen and General McChrystal and General McRaven. McRaven was the fellow who led the assault on bin Laden, and many, many other military officials. And generally speaking, and again, I'm a historian, and maybe I should be waiting 20 years or 30 years before I make these judgments. But it appears to me that public opinion is swinging, not as it did in 1968 in favor of, quote, law and order, but against the abusive use of power by the administration.
Conservatives saying this is all over everywhere from conservative talk shows, TV and radio, to Facebook and Twitter. The conservatives say the president does not run local police departments, local mayors run local police, and the conservatives argue that these brutality cases are happening in Democrat cities. What do you make of that argument, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, I think they're occurring all over. I mean, Democratic cities. I don't know if what he means is that there are Democratic mayors, such as Mayor De Blasio. I think there's something to that. The police. Look, we have a situation in Buffalo where the police acted. I think most of us would agree in an inappropriate way by pushing down that 75-year-old protester. And then it wasn't so much that they pushed him down. I mean, one could, perhaps excuse that because the cops are under orders. But then when one policeman tried to bend down to help this man who was bleeding from his head and bleeding from his ear, another cop pushed him away, a cop with a gold badge, obviously an officer. There's something inhumane about that. And I think that, again, this is playing into a reaction, a public reaction, quite different from what the conservatives would like to believe. And I think it's also important to say this. I listen to Fox News, I listen to MSNBC, I listen to CNN, and occasionally I listen to some of the mainline broadcasters. Fox tends to emphasize the degree to which there was violent protest. MSNBC tends to emphasize the degree to which there was peaceful protest. In the real world, most of the protest has been peaceful. In Hornell, New York, it was peaceful. In Buffalo, it was peaceful. In Alfred, New York, it was peaceful. We had 4 days of demonstrations here. So, to try to somehow, suggest that the country is falling apart because of violence in the streets and cities led by Democratic mayors, I just don't think it really. I don't think it carries much weight. Most cops, most police are very, very law-abiding themselves. They don't want to hurt. They certainly don't want to create problems. But there are some cops who really are not very good cops, and they ruin it for everyone else. And we've certainly seen examples of that in different cities.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Stay with us.
Springwater Amish Workshop in Springwater is once again open for business. You know, summer living is here. Enhance your outdoor living spaces with quality constructed Amish-made furniture and accessories of polyvinyl or southern yellow pressure-treated pine. Do your baby chicks need a home? Springwater Amish Workshop has chicken coops in stock. 2020 storage sheds and gazebos are arriving weekly, or they can order just what you want. That's Springwater Amish Workshop, 7936 Mill Street, that's Route 15, in Springwater. And check out their website, springwateramishworkshop.com, to see what they can do.
Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University longtime history professor. In the last segment, Dr. Ostrower, you said something about watching both Fox and CNN and maybe other channels too. And I wanted to make a point. Kevin Doran used to do the same thing. He talked about watching what the one media would say and then what another media outlet was saying. Just kind of curious. I know why Kevin did it, because Kevin said he wanted to see how the media was influencing the different political groups. What's your rationale behind that?
Well, I would sympathize with what Kevin Doran was doing. I think it's really important to understand the world from different perspectives, to understand why different people are reacting in the ways that they are. Obviously, we have a very, very divided country, and I think that divisiveness is a product of many, many different factors, but one of them is the degree to which liberals tend to watch CNN and cable news, and conservatives watch Fox, and often, not always, but often they are providing a very, very different version of political events. If a cop is attacked by a single protester in Dallas, it's going to be reported on Fox. By the same token, if a cop attacks a peaceful protester in Buffalo, it's going to be reported on MSNBC and on CNN. And, you know, I'm exaggerating a little bit because, for instance, the Buffalo incident was reported on Fox. But these stations have, I think, in their own way, tended to deepen the sense of divisiveness. What I find most troubling, and I think this goes back to something that we were saying earlier, and certainly Admiral Mullen and General Mattis both spoke to this, is the degree to which the president, the degree to which the president of the United States is himself so very divisive. General Mattis. General Mattis said the following. He said, Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. Brian, this man served as Secretary of Defense for 2 years. He was a Marine for his entire career. He is one of the most highly respected Marines in the United States of America. For a man like this, who is not a Democrat, for a man like this to say what he did about the president, I think, says plenty about the degree to which the divisiveness is not only a product of what we're hearing on different radio or TV stations, but is also a product of what's coming out of the White House.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower on this day in history. Back in 1964, the CIA put out a report saying they did not believe that the rest of Southeast Asia would fall if Laos and South Vietnam came under North Vietnamese communist control. Now, the head they did not buy into Johnson's domino theory, if it was Johnson's, but Johnson was buying into the domino theory, and that's why the U.S., he believed, had to get into Vietnam. Dr. Ostrower, the head of the CIA in 1964, a guy named John McCone. What do we know about John McCone, and what do you make of that 1964 CIA report?
Well, John McCone was a kind of a Wall Street Republican. He was a very conservative guy. But the CIA has been, for the most part, and look, they've made some serious mistakes, not the least of which they did not predict the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, they've had their own mistakes. Certainly, the Bay of Pigs was a big-time CIA mistake. But for the most part, the CIA has been nonpartisan. The CIA has been based on, if you will, information rather than simply, kind of gut feeling. And the CIA in 1964 was absolutely on target. The fact of the matter is that the so-called domino theory was not just Johnson's. It was shared by Truman. It was shared by Eisenhower after him. It was shared by John Kennedy, and then by Johnson, and then eventually by Nixon himself. Okay, so the domino theory had a long history in this country. What the CIA was saying was that it's wrong, okay, that these countries are not going to fall. The domino theory would have suggested that, all right, if Vietnam goes, then Laos goes, then Cambodia goes, then Thailand, then Burma, then India, then Australia, then New Zealand, and then Japan, and pretty soon you have submarines off the coast of California. Well, we know that did not happen, and we also know that no other government in that area, with the single exception of the Laotian, I shouldn't say single, with the exception of the Laotian government and the Cambodian government, no other government bought that theory. Well, after the Vietnam War, Laos did become a communist state. Cambodia did become a communist state. So in that sense, there was something to the domino theory, but much, much less than we had anticipated, because none of the other countries, including the major countries, Indonesia, Pakistan, and so forth, none of them became communist as a result of what happened in Vietnam.
Also on this day in history, 1954, the U.S. Army Attorney Joseph Welch gives that famous speech, which is credited for bringing down McCarthy, that speech where he says, "Have you no decency, sir?" That was after McCarthy pointed the finger and accused one of Welch's aides of being a legal arm of the Communist Party. And the History Channel's website says that the American people cheered the fall of McCarthy. Your thoughts on that statement by the History Channel that the American people were glad to see McCarthy have a downfall?
When McCarthy was riding high, about one half, literally 50% of the American public was with him, and 50% was in opposition to him. What McCarthy did, in other words, was to create a straw man. He created a devil, if you will, a conspiracy theory. In fact, he called it a conspiracy. He called it a conspiracy so vast. The greatest conspiracy in history. Words that I think President Trump would probably sympathize with. The fact of the matter is that, sure, there were communists in the American government during that period, but very few of them. Or there were probably more members of the FBI in the Communist Party than there were communists in the Communist Party. McCarthy tried to smear anyone who disagreed with him as a communist. So that socialists became communists, liberals became communists. It was his way, in other words, of amassing power. It was his way of, essentially discrediting those who he wanted to discredit. And he did a pretty good job of it. But he overplayed his hand in much the same way I think that Trump overplayed his hand this week. And consequently, initially, a single Republican senator from Maine by the name of Margaret Chase Smith, and then Edward R. Murrow, the very, very highly respected CBS commentator, came out with very, very damning, statements of and, charges against McCarthy, and that began to weaken him. And then on top of that, Joseph Welch, during the Army McCarthy hearings, those were hearings in which McCarthy claimed that the Army was riddled with communists. And Welch said finally, when McCarthy very unfairly attacked a young man, he said, "Have you no decency, sir? Have you no decency?" And that resonated. The American public, when I say the American public, more than 50% of the American public understood that Joseph Welsh was absolutely right. And it really broke the back of the McCarthy movement. Sometimes, we historians say, well, individuals in history are really not all that important. It's more that we should be focusing on great social movements or economic movements. But sometimes individuals are very, very important. And I think that Joseph Welsh was a fine example of exactly how those individuals make a difference. And I'm going to predict to you that General Mattis, I'm going to predict right now that General Mattis is going to become the Joseph Welsh of 2020.
With that, we have to go. Dr. Gary Ostrower, as always, thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me here.